No one in the sapphire-lit throne hall understood exactly how the disaster started. Perhaps it was exhaustion after 14 hours of non-stop diplomatic negotiations. Perhaps it was the way the Dragon Empress's shoulders slumped, claws twitching, eyes glassy with a pain she refused to acknowledge. Or perhaps it was the simple, dangerous truth that humans sometimes act before they think. Whatever the reason, the moment it happened. The universe held its breath. The human stepped forward and hugged her, not a bow, not a salute, not the rigid ritual gesture the handbook described. An honest, full-body human hug. Arms wrapped around 7 feet of armored scales and imperial authority. And in that single affectionate act, Ambassador Elias Reed accidentally committed what alien historians would later call the most reckless embrace in the history of diplomacy. Gasps struck the hall like shockwaves. Soldiers lunged but stopped mid-motion, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Advisors threw themselves to the ground. 2 fainted outright. Protocol enforcers screamed orders no one dared execute. Holographic cameras whirred in disbelief. Every lens, zooming in on a moment that should have triggered the kind of execution reserved for traitors and fools. The Empress, High Sovereign Talaneth of the Draconic Dominion, breaker of Conqueror worlds and daughter of fire stood. Frozen. Elias didn't let go. He didn't hug her to manipulate her or curry favor. He hugged her because her tail had curled inward the way a terrified animal protects itself, and because her voice had shaken when she ordered the room to stop arguing. Humans are simple that way. We move toward pain even when it's dangerous. And her pain had been obvious to him, though no one else in the room knew what to do with it. Finally, her voice came cracked, not regal. "What are you doing?" Elias blinked and stepped back too late to salvage dignity. "Sorry, It looked like you needed a hug." Need? The most powerful monarch in known space? Her war crown steamed, and the heat bled into her cheeks. For the first time in living memory, the Empress of 1,000 conquered fleets looked embarrassed. The throne room went silent enough to hear a heartbeat, hers or his. Neither could tell. Execution was inevitable. Everyone expected the floor to open, or the soldier dreadnoughts to fire, or the Empress to tear him in two with her claws. But instead she asked in a voice too soft for legend, "Remain." The word crashed into the hall like a meteor. 100 kneeling warriors jerked upright in disbelief. The Imperial Chamberlain choked on air. One general immediately requested retirement. No outsider, not even royalty from annexed worlds, had ever been granted remain. It wasn't a command. It was permission, intimate, personal. Elias, bewildered, stayed frozen in place. Everyone else, the Empress continued, voice rising back to imperial thunder, leave. Chaos exploded instantly. Advisors begged, guards protested, commanders insisted their Empress was compromised. She silenced them with a glare so lethal that even the ventilation system seemed to stop breathing. Within a minute the throne hall emptied, leaving only a stunned human and a ruler who looked like she might disintegrate under the weight of her own emotions. When the great doors sealed shut, the Empress spoke without looking at him. "You touched me in front of my entire court. I noticed that, yes, you showed softness when weakness is punishable by death. That's not great." Her tail thrashed once, rattling the marble. "Do you not fear me?" "Oh, I definitely do." "Then why? Because fear doesn't mean I can't care." That line simple. Instinctive, human, cut through her armor in a way no blade had. She stared at him, her burning eyes searching for deception. She found none. Humans are infuriating that way. Even when terrified, they mean what they feel. So the hug, she said slowly, was not a dominance ritual? Not a claim? Not a challenge? It was comfort. She blinked, baffled. "Your species comforts by crushing ribs?" He winced. "Yeah, we can work on the pressure part." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And you did this for me. Not for power, but for me." He nodded. "It seemed like you needed it." The Empress looked away, shoulders rising and falling in a tremor, not of rage, but of relief she didn't want to acknowledge. "Emotional support is forbidden for rulers." They must remain symbols, not beings. That's horrible. It keeps the galaxy obedient. And it's killing you. Her jaw clenched. You presume too much, human. And you feel too much to admit it. They stared at each other, scales and skin. Fire and warmth, predator and comforter, two creatures who should never have shared breath. Much less emotion. Finally, she asked the question that would reshape galactic politics and rewrite the Empress's reputation for centuries to come. Will you embrace me again? The request toppled protocol, tradition, and every rule written since the Dominion rose. The Empress, born of cruelty and purpose, quietly asked for comfort like a child terrified to admit loneliness. Elias didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward slowly, respectfully, letting her lean into him rather than forcing contact. She lowered her crown to his shoulder, body quivering with the shock of finally being held by someone who didn't want anything from her. Not power, not favor, not fear, just connection. When they parted, she wiped the tears from her eyes with a claw before anyone could see anyone except him. From this day, she whispered, voice still fragile, you will report to my side daily. No matter what the court decrees, you will remain. The words sounded like a sentence and a sanctuary at once. Elias swallowed. Yes, Your Majesty. No, she said sharply. When we are alone, call me Talaneth. The human had no idea what that meant, what doors it opened, what wars it risked, what love it implied, but he agreed. Okay, Talaneth. She exhaled a shaky breath that shook the pillars of the hall, and the galaxy began to change, one hug at a time. The Dragon Empress didn't release him for the next 3 hours. Every time some minister tried to resume discussion of troop deployment or border treaties, she simply tightened her wings around the human scientist and rumbled, later, hug now. At first the generals stared in disbelief, then in resignation, and finally in dread as they realized their entire war plan had been derailed by what humans casually call physical affection. The human comforted her as if it were the most natural thing in the world, whispering reassurance without even noticing the death glares from draconic nobility, who would have been executed for such closeness. A single misplaced hand on her back sent her tail curling in flustered delight, and the entire throne room stopped breathing. Dragons could conquer worlds without hesitation, but, apparently, they had no defense against cuddling. He tried to stand, cheeks burning, murmuring that maybe governmental affairs shouldn't be delayed for a hug break. The Empress tilted her snout toward him, eyes narrow with that terrifying combination of vulnerability and command. You will not deprive me of warmth, she declared, as though she were speaking the law of physics. And because he had the survival instincts of every human working with volatile alien royalty, he sat right back down. The council groaned as she curled her tail around his legs possessively. One general whispered that humanity had doomed the empire with softness, and another whispered that if softness looked that good, maybe doom wasn't so bad. The Empress shut them up with a glare so cold it could strip metal. When the next diplomatic envoy arrived, they expected ceremonial hostility, maybe even ritual combat. Instead, they walked into the throne room and found the Empress purring asleep on her human pillow. Rumor says the envoy nearly fainted, terrified that they'd walked into something intimate. But the human just whispered, She hasn't slept in days. The tension of war evaporated not because of any treaty, but because no alien race wanted to be the one responsible for waking a sleeping dragon. While the council worked in frantic silence, pretending this was normal, the Empress shifted slightly and tightened her hold on him, breathing like someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. The entire palace realized the truth. This wasn't infatuation, it was sanctuary. When she finally woke, she found him still there, still supporting her. No one else had dared move him. The Empress scanned the room, alert as if she'd been caught doing something weak. But the human smiled without judgment, and for a terrifying moment her mask slipped. She thanked him with a voice so soft that the great hall trembled in disbelief. Then she added, in her usual thunderous tone, that any witness to her softness would be executed if they ever spoke of it. Half the hall fainted. The other half dived for quill and parchment to draft oaths of silence. The human couldn't stop laughing at the whiplash. And she pretended she hadn't heard him, later. During a private meeting, private only in the sense that every guard pressed their ears against the doors, the Empress confronted him about what exactly he had done to her. She demanded to know how his scent, presence, warmth, and touch had bypassed every emotional defense of the draconic species. Scientists dream of questions like that, so he answered honestly. Humans hug because the body remembers safety better than the mind does. She stared in shock, as though hearing the meaning of love for the first time. Then, in embarrassed fury, she asked why humans weren't extinct if they went around giving enemy species weapons that powerful. He just shrugged and said humanity survived because hugs weren't meant as weapons, but they became ones anyway. For a queen who lived in a world of strategy, that paradox was devastating. She asked if he would teach her how to hug properly. The palace guards collectively stopped breathing. He agreed gently, adjusting her posture and telling her that real comfort required vulnerability, not dominance. She tried and her wings shook. She wasn't used to giving comfort. She only knew how to demand it. But she tried again, and this time she trembled without shame. He held her until she steadied, and she whispered so quietly it was almost nothing that she had not been held like that in centuries. He didn't ask why. Humans have a universal skill. We know when not to pry into pain that someone barely survives admitting. That night, the rumor reached every corner of the galaxy. The Empress was not in love with a human. She was safe with one. That difference terrified militaries far more than romance ever could. Alliances restructured themselves overnight. Hostile nations scrambled to send humans as diplomatic envoys. It was strategic chaos because everyone wanted someone who could hug a dragon into peace. The worst part was that none of them understood that it wasn't hugs that mattered. It was kindness. And that's something you can't mass-produce or weaponize, of course. The council wanted to spin the situation as a political advantage. They suggested assigning the human to travel across the empire and hug high-priority figures. The Empress nearly tore the table in half. She announced, with enough fire to sterilize a continent, that the human was not a resource to be allocated or deployed. She didn't say, "He's mine," but her tail was wrapped around his chair the entire time. And the point was impossible to miss. The council took the hint. Even someone who had never studied dragon physiology could tell she would burn stars before letting anyone else near him. Still, the Empress wasn't naive. She asked him, with the softness of someone terrified of the answer, whether humans hugged everyone casually or whether he had chosen her. The question shook him because he knew that she didn't fear war, she feared being replaceable. So he told her the truth. Yes, humans hug friends, family, lovers, strangers in distress, but they only give real warmth to people who deserve it. She didn't cry. Dragons don't cry. But her voice caught, and that was worse. In that single admission, the stakes of the entire galaxy shifted. A dragon could rule by fear, but a human could rule by love, and the cosmos did not yet know which was stronger. But it was about to find out. The first real crisis struck 3 days later. A hostile delegation arrived unannounced, demanding immediate access to the human weapon of emotional subjugation. They declared that the Empress had destabilized interstellar diplomacy by monopolizing humanity's affection-based psychological warfare specialist. The human nearly choked hearing the phrase, because nothing kills romantic tension like being described as a weaponized emotional support mammal. The Empress, however, took it as an insult of the highest order and not for the last time threatened. To erase a planet for implying her human was a tactical asset rather than a person. Flames licked the ceiling before she managed to reel her temper back in. The human suggested he might simply talk to the hostile diplomats to ease the tension. The Empress looked ready to consume the sun before letting him within 5 meters of anyone calling dibs on his affection. But the human insisted, not because he owed diplomacy anything, but because he didn't want to be the reason an empire burned. His kindness wasn't weakness, it was responsibility. The council whispered that only a human could walk willingly into danger out of empathy instead of duty. The Empress followed him to the delegation chamber personally, her tail flicking like a loaded crossbow the entire way. The foreign commander began negotiations by sneering that humans must be romantically indiscriminate. The Empress reached for her warhammer, the human reached for patience. He asked the commander if he had ever cared about anyone, not politically, not strategically, but personally. The room went still. The commander sputtered in confusion, insisting war leaders did not indulge in such foolishness. The human smiled sadly because that sentence alone explained why galaxies kept falling apart. He told the commander affection wasn't a resource, real connection came only when someone chose you. It couldn't be demanded, traded, or weaponized. Someone in the delegation wiped their eyes like they had been hit by a philosophy textbook. The Empress watched, stunned, as war-hardened military leaders fell apart before a man who simply chose compassion every time a crueler option existed. Of course, kindness didn't solve everything. The commander then asked with lethal bluntness whether the Empress had earned the human's affection. Dragons herd challenge, the human herd insecurity. And insecurity, unlike hostility, doesn't deserve a fight. He spoke openly, saying that the Empress didn't conquer his loyalty. She earned his trust by letting herself be vulnerable. The Empress shot upright as if the words were too sharp to touch. For a dragon queen whose power came from fear, hearing that love came from vulnerability was equal parts blessing and torment. The diplomats left with a truce not because they wanted peace, but because none of them wanted to risk provoking someone who could make a dragon blush. When the doors closed, the Empress demanded to know why he would speak of her so openly. He didn't evade. He told her that affection doesn't survive behind walls, that emotional armor protects the body but strangles the heart. She hissed in frustration, pacing like someone who had been handed a weapon they didn't know how to hold. She had been raised to conquer planets, not feelings. She swore that vulnerability was dangerous. He agreed, but he added that pretending not to care was far more dangerous in the long run. She hated how right he was. Yet she leaned into him. Anyway, wings low and something halfway between surrender and courage. The council panicked. If the Empress continued on this emotional trajectory, she might love the human truly love him, and no strategist in the galaxy had ever studied the consequences of a dragon in love. Economists predicted crises, generals predicted revolutions, philosophers predicted poetry. The Empress shut down every attempt to evaluate the strategic impact of human affection, stating that if anyone dared quantify her feelings, they would be reduced to sentimental ashes. One advisor fainted from the sheer romance threat level of it, but conflict brewed from within, not from outside. A noble faction approached the human privately, claiming that if the Empress became too emotionally attached, she would appear weak. They suggested he distance himself from her to preserve political stability. They didn't threaten him, not directly. They offered him a position, a lab, unlimited funding, and safety, but only if he stopped holding her. He listened to their entire speech with polite calm, thanked them for their concern, and left. He didn't tell the Empress not because he hid things, but because he refused to add fuel to her rage. Humans don't love by feeding darkness. We love by refusing to abandon someone to it. He found her alone that night, staring at the stars like they were easier to understand than her own heart. She asked him if he feared what loving her could cost. He hesitated not because he doubted her, but because he knew the truth mattered. Loving someone powerful is always dangerous, but so is loving someone fragile. Affection is risk either way. He stepped closer, not foolishly, not fearlessly, but willingly, because the point wasn't that she was safe. It was that she was worth the danger. She shook, the way armor shakes when it starts to crack. She asked why humans were like this, why they ran toward emotional risk instead of away from it. He told her that if humans didn't risk heartbreak, they would never get love at all. The Empress pulled him into a hug so tight it would have killed any other species. And for the first time, she hugged not to receive comfort but to give it. Her wings wrapped around him like promise rather than possession. Her voice trembled as she told him that if the galaxy demanded she choose between power and him, she would choose him and then destroy the galaxy for making her choose in the first place. It was both terrifying and beautiful in the uniquely human way that danger and love often share the same heartbeat. That night, across the Empire, An impossible rumor spread. The Dragon Empress was learning how to love, and a single human was teaching her, and the universe was not ready. The breaking point came the following week. A coalition of rival empires arrived with a single purpose: to separate the human from the Empress. They claimed the balance of the galaxy depended on neutral custody of the affection-based superweapon. The human scientist had never felt more objectified in his life. Apparently, across 13 star systems, he was now categorized as a strategic cuddle nuke. The Empress was not amused. She stood on her throne platform with the human beside her, wings flared and eyes burning, prepared to kill half the galaxy in the name of emotional sovereignty. The coalition replied with threats of war. And no one doubted they were serious. The council begged the human to step away from the throne to avoid bloodshed. The Empress snarled that anyone asking him to leave would be exiled into the void. The human stared at both sides' political pressure on one side, draconic ferocity on the other, and realized something important. War wasn't erupting because of love. War was erupting because everyone wanted to control love. So the human did what the most dangerous members of his species always do. He rejected the question entirely. He stepped forward, away from the Empress, not in surrender but in defiance. The room gasped for different reasons, some thinking he was bowing to the coalition, others thinking he was betraying the Empress. But his voice carried through the throne hall with the clarity of someone who had decided affection was not a commodity. He declared that no empire owns a hug, no council controls comfort, and no military decides who deserves warmth. He said love was not a weapon, but a rebellion, because if you give it freely, nobody can take it from you. The coalition ambassadors stood stunned. Speeches useless in the face of a concept their politics had never accounted for, the coalition demanded. He proved neutrality immediately by hugging someone other than the Empress. The Empress nearly burst into flames at the audacity of the request. For a moment he hesitated, not because he feared her anger, but because he feared her heartbreak. He turned to her, first not asking permission, but trust. She held his gaze, and he jolted inside because she didn't look angry. She looked terrified he would choose someone else and she would have to pretend. She was strong enough to survive it. So the human hugged one of the terrified foreign delegates. Not warmly, not intimately, but kindly, genuine comfort rather than bond. And the Empress didn't burn the hall. She didn't snarl or threaten or break the marble floors. She stood still, trembling with the kind of pride that hurts, because she finally understood the lesson she had been running from. Love is strongest when you choose someone even though you could choose anyone. And she realized he chose her not because no one else needed him, but because she needed him in a way she never let herself need anyone before. The coalition fell apart instantly, because the moment they saw the hug was not a mind-controlling death grip of passion, but normal human compassion. The fear collapsed under its own absurdity. Affection couldn't be monopolized. Humans weren't weapons. The galaxy had been panicking over nothing and everything. The brilliance of love is that it destroys both tyranny and paranoia without firing a shot. The coalition withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because they were confused by a cultural concept they couldn't legislate. Empathy. When the hall emptied and the doors sealed, the Empress didn't move. Her eyes glowed with something that would have been vulnerability in anyone else, but in her was so much more powerful. She asked, voice almost breaking, if hugging others meant he didn't care for her. And he walked right up to her, placed a hand on her cheek, and told her what no strategist had ever taught her: love isn't exclusive because of isolation. It's exclusive because of depth. He told her that kindness belonged to many, but love belonged to one. Her wings wrapped slowly around him, and this time there was no fear of witnesses, no shame, no defenses. It was simply affection, raw, terrifying, mutual. From that day onward, the palace changed. Policies shifted not because of romance, but because the Empress began ruling with something alien to dragon culture: warmth. She still roared, she still conquered. She still terrified people on a daily basis, but now she asked what people felt before she decided what they deserved. Dragons didn't soften, dragons simply became more dangerous once they learned how to care. The human didn't become a prince. or consort or weapon. The Empress refused every title that implied ownership. Instead, she gave him something no warlord ever had: full autonomy right beside her throne. He wasn't hers because she captured him. He was hers because he stayed. And she stayed because he didn't run when she showed. The parts of herself dragons were trained to hide. Galactic history later recorded the era as the age of the warm-blooded throne, a reign where peace grew not from treaties but from tenderness. And war became rare not because fear disappeared but because affection became contagious. Some diplomats returned home hugging their own leaders. Some generals adopted emotional honesty workshops to the horror of their soldiers. No one understood how humans had done it. But every scholar agreed on one thing: if the galaxy survived, it was because a single human introduced something too chaotic and too gentle to weaponize. Late one night, on the balcony where the stars looked close enough to hold, the Empress asked the question she had been avoiding since the beginning. Not a command, not a test, just a whisper that almost dissolved in the wind. "Why do you love me?" He didn't answer with poetry or philosophy. He simply told her the truth because she chose to become more than what the universe expected of her. She laughed then, a rare and unguarded sound that shook the tiles under their feet. And she told him she loved him because only a fool would hug a dragon. And only a king of fools would do it twice. She pulled him into her arms then, not as a display of dominance or need, but because love, even for dragons, is easier when someone shows you how. And if the galaxy slept easier afterward, it wasn't because war ended.